The heat of the Dakota sun was a physical weight pressing down on Ethan Blackwood's shoulders as he knelt. Below him, in the dust of a bone-dry creek bed, lay a child, a Lakota girl, no older than 8, her buckskin dress torn, and her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. He was miles from his ranch, completely alone, with a storm of violet clouds gathering on the horizon. He reached out a trembling hand to check for a pulse, a simple act of mercy. But when he looked up again, the world had changed. The ridge above him, empty seconds before, was now lined with 100 silent warriors. They hadn't made a sound. They were simply there, and their eyes, every single pair, were fixed on him. The land was a study in thirst. Under the vast, unforgiving sky of the Dakota Territory, Ethan Blackwood's ranch, the Blackwood Reach, clung to the edge of the rolling plains like a stubborn burr on a wolf's hide. The year 1876 had been particularly cruel. The sun had baked the earth into a cracked mosaic of ochre and brown, and the life-giving waters of Coyote Creek had dwindled to a muddy trickle, a grim reminder of nature's fickle temper. Ethan, at 23, felt the weight of it all in his bones. It had been 2 years since his father, Marcus Blackwood, had been laid to rest on the small hill overlooking the homestead. 2 years of Ethan trying to fill boots that felt impossibly large. His father had been a man of quiet strength and complex principles, a man who had carved a life out of this harsh landscape through grit and an uncanny understanding of its rhythms. He had left Ethan the ranch a herd of hardy longhorns, bearing the B-W brand and a legacy of solitude. The days were long and filled with the relentless labor of keeping the ranch alive, mending fences that seemed to rot under the oppressive sun, digging wells that yielded more dust than water, and riding the perimeter, his gaze constantly sweeping the horizon. The threat wasn't just the drought. Tensions with the Lakota, whose ancestral lands these were, simmered like a pot left too long on the fire. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills had brought a flood of prospectors and settlers, each new wagon train a fresh wound on the land and a broken promise to its native people. Ethan, unlike many of his neighbors, felt no hatred for the Lakota, only a weary sense of shared misfortune. His father had taught him respect for them, a respect born not of sentimentality, but of pragmatism. "They were here first, son," Marcus used to say, his voice low and gravelly. "This land speaks their language. Best you learn a few words." On this particular afternoon, Ethan had ridden further than usual, chasing a half-dozen stray cattle that had wandered off in a desperate search for greener pastures. The air was thick and still pregnant with the promise of a storm that refused to break. The sky to the west was a bruised purple, but overhead the sun remained a merciless tyrant. He'd finally corralled the strays, their ribs showing starkly against their hides, and was following the ghostly scar of the Coyote Creek bed back towards his homestead, when he saw it. A splash of color against the muted earth tones. Not a wildflower, not a discarded piece of cloth snagged on a thorny bush. It was the intricate beadwork on a small moccasin. He dismounted from his horse Clementine, her chestnut coat dark with sweat. His hand rested instinctively on the butt of the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at his hip. He approached slowly, his boots crunching on the dry gravel. There, sheltered by the meager shade of an overhanging rock, lay the child. She was Lakota. Her skin, the color of rich earth, was filmed with dust and drawn tight over her small bones. Her dark hair was matted, and her deerskin dress was torn at the shoulder. But it was her breathing that snared his heart in a fist of ice. It was a faint, almost imperceptible flutter, a fragile bird trapped in a collapsing cage. He saw no visible wounds, no sign of an attack. It was as if the life was simply leaving her, fading away like the last ember of a dying fire. For a long moment, Ethan was paralyzed by a stark choice. To his left was the path back to his isolated cabin, to safety and ignorance. To his right lay this child, a living, breathing embodiment of the conflict that defined this land. To help her was to invite trouble he could scarcely imagine. The nearest town, Redemption, was a full day's ride, and its sheriff, a portly, complacent man named Barlow, was more interested in collecting taxes than keeping the peace. Bringing a Lakota child to him would be met with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Leaving her here was a death sentence. He thought of his father. Marcus Blackwood had been a hard man, but never a cruel one. He had lived by a code, and that code did not include leaving a child to die in the dust. Cursing under his breath, Ethan gently scooped the girl into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of flour, her head lolling against his shoulder. A low moan, softer than the whisper of the wind, escaped her cracked lips. As he stood cradling the child, he scanned the surrounding bluffs and ridges. Nothing. Just the shimmering heat haze and the eerie silence of the plains. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, her small body nestled against his chest, and urged Clementine into a steady, ground-eating trot. The ride back was a blur of anxiety. With every jolt of the horse, he feared the little life in his arms would be extinguished. He found himself talking to her, his voice a low murmur. "Hang on, little one. It's not far now. Just a little further." He didn't know if she could understand him or even hear him, but the sound of his own voice cut through the oppressive silence. His cabin, a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and clay, came into view as the sun began its slow descent, painting the bruised sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. It wasn't much a single room, a stone fireplace, a bed, a table and shelves lined with the essentials of a solitary life. But it was home. It was sanctuary. Inside, he laid her gently on his own cot, the rough wool of his blanket, a stark contrast to her delicate form. He fetched water from the barrel, the last of what he'd hauled from the well that morning. He dampened a clean rag and began to carefully wipe the grime from her face. Her features were fine, her eyelashes long against her fever-flushed cheeks. As he cleaned a smudge of dirt from her neck, his fingers brushed against a small leather pouch tied with a thin rawhide cord. It was tucked inside her dress. He hesitated, feeling like a thief, but a strange compulsion made him pull it free. It was soft, worn buckskin, decorated with a single unfamiliar symbol, beaded in blue and white. He didn't dare open it. He placed it on the small table beside the bed, a silent testament to a life he knew nothing about. The girl's fever was raging. He spent the next hour trying to bring it down, dribbling small amounts of water between her lips and placing cool, damp cloths on her forehead. The storm outside finally broke, but it was a dry thunderstorm, a rage of wind and lightning with no rain to soothe the parched earth. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, making the flames in the hearth dance and flicker. As the light outside faded to a deep twilight, the girl's breathing seemed to steady slightly. A fragile tendril of hope began to curl in Ethan's chest. He had done the right thing. Whatever came next, he had chosen compassion over fear. He rose and stretched his aching back, his shadow long and distorted in the firelight. He needed to check on Clementine to secure the corral. He grabbed his worn hat from a peg by the door, took one last look at the sleeping child, and stepped outside into the cool, wind-whipped air. He blinked his eyes, adjusting to the gloom, and then he froze. The world had gone utterly, terrifyingly still. The wind had died, as if a giant hand had smothered it. The very air crackled with a silent, unseen energy. The ridge, the low rise of land not 50 yards from his cabin, which had been empty save for a few stunted pines when he arrived, was no longer empty. Silhouetted against the last vestiges of daylight stood a line of men on horseback. A long, unbroken line. They were motionless, like granite statues carved from the very rock of the hills. He couldn't count them in the fading light, but his gut clenched with the certain knowledge that there were dozens, maybe 100. They were Lakota warriors. Their forms were unmistakable, even in the gloom, the lines of their horses, the faint outlines of feathers in their hair, the glint of metal from a rifle barrel. They had made no sound, no war cry, no thundering hooves. They had simply materialized from the twilight, a silent, spectral army. And from the center of the line, one figure sat taller than the rest. His gaze fixed Ethan knew without a doubt directly on him. 100 warriors, 100 pools of eyes, all trained on his small, vulnerable cabin. And inside, sleeping on his cot, was the reason they had come. The air became a solid thing in Ethan's lungs. He couldn't draw a full breath. His heart, which had been pounding with the exertion of the day, now hammered against his ribs with a new primal rhythm of fear. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to dive back inside the cabin and bar the door, to grab his Winchester rifle from its pegs above the fireplace. But he was rooted to the spot, pinned by the sheer, unblinking intensity of that collective gaze. They were a force of nature, an elemental presence that seemed to have sprung from the wounded earth itself. The silence was their weapon. It was more profound and more terrifying than any war cry. It spoke of discipline, of absolute purpose. It was the silence of the hawk before it dows, of the wolf before it strikes. The wind had vanished. The chirping of the night insects had ceased. The only sound in the universe was the frantic drumming of his own blood in his ears. He forced his eyes to move, to take in the scene in more detail, though his mind struggled to process it. The warriors were not painted for war in the garish colors he'd seen in sensationalist newspaper illustrations. They were grim, solemn. Their faces, cast in the deep shadows of the encroaching night, were masks of stone. Some held rifles cradled in their arms. Others held bows or lances that stabbed at the bruised twilight sky. Their ponies stood as still as their riders, patient and attuned to their master's intent. They were not a rabble. They were a single cohesive entity, a living, breathing weapon aimed at the heart of his world. In the center of the line sat the leader. Even from this distance, his presence was immense. He sat on a powerful war pony, a magnificent beast with a dark coat that drank the light. The man himself was broad-shouldered, his posture ramrod straight. He wore a simple buckskin shirt, but a full eagle feather headdress flowed down his back, a symbol of immense authority and respect. Each feather, Ethan knew, represented a brave deed, a coup counted against an enemy. This was no mere war chief. This was a man of great stature among his people. Ethan's hand twitched a phantom impulse to reach for his Colt. He suppressed it immediately. Such a move would be suicide. It would be the spark that ignited the powder keg. He had to stand his ground to show he was not a coward, but also not a threat. He forced himself to take a slow, deliberate step away from the cabin door into the open, making sure his hands were visible, empty. He could feel the sweat trickle down his spine, cold despite the day's residual heat. His mind raced, replaying the moment he found the girl. Had they been watching him then? Had they tracked him all the way back to his cabin, allowing him to lead them to their destination? It seemed impossible. He had scanned the horizon a dozen times. He had seen nothing, heard nothing. They moved like ghosts, masters of the landscape he only inhabited. As his eyes adjusted further to the gloom, he began to pick out individual details among the silent host. He saw a young warrior, barely older than himself, his face a mask of taut fury, a hawk feather tied in his dark hair. He saw an older man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and scars, his eyes holding a deep, weary sorrow. He saw the glint of a silver armband on another, the intricate quill work on a quiver. These were not faceless savages. They were men, fathers, sons, brothers, and they had come for one of their own. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The standoff continued, a silent battle of wills waged across 50 yards of dusty earth. Ethan felt as though he were being physically dissected by their stares, his motives, his very soul laid bare and judged. He thought of the girl inside her small, frail body. What had happened to her? How had she become separated from her people? Had they assumed the worst? Did they see him as her kidnapper, her abuser? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through his veins. Finally, after a period that felt like a lifetime, the leader made a move. He raised his right hand, palm open, in a gesture that was not quite peace, but a command for patience. Then, with a fluid grace that belied his size, he dismounted. A younger warrior, the one with the hawk feather, immediately moved to take the reins of his pony. The leader began to walk towards him. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his moccasins making no sound on the hard, packed earth. He was alone, leaving his 100 warriors as a silent, menacing backdrop. With every step he took, his formidable presence grew. He was taller than Ethan had first thought, well over 6 feet, with a warrior's lean, powerful build. His face, now visible in the faint light spilling from the cabin window, was striking. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a mouth set in a firm, unyielding line. But it was his eyes that held Ethan captive. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a pain so profound it seemed to pull all the light from the air around them. The chief stopped about 10 feet from Ethan. He did not speak. He simply stood, his gaze sweeping over Ethan, then to the cabin door, then back to Ethan's face. The silence stretched again, taut and vibrant. It was a test, a demand for an explanation without a single word being uttered. Ethan knew he had to speak first. His throat was dry. His tongue felt thick and useless. He swallowed hard, forcing moisture into his mouth. "I found her," he said. His voice came out as a croak, and he cleared his throat, trying again, striving for a tone that was steady, respectful, and firm. "I found her by the creek bed. She was alone, and she is sick, very sick. I brought her here to give her water to help her." The chief's expression did not change. His dark eyes remained locked on Ethan's, searching, probing. He gave no sign that he had heard, or if he had, that he believed him. Behind him, the 100 warriors remained as still as the stones on a forgotten grave, a silent jury awaiting the verdict of their leader. The weight of their judgment, of their potential for cataclysmic violence, pressed down on Ethan heavier and more suffocating than the Dakota sun had ever been. The chief's name was Lakota, which meant friend of the bear in the tongue of his people the Sikangu Lakota. The name was apt. He possessed the quiet, immense power of the creature, the sense that he could be a placid, lumbering presence one moment, and an unstoppable force of fury the next. His gaze held Ethan pinned for another long moment before he finally spoke. His voice was like the rumbling of distant thunder, low and resonant. "You are Marcus Blackwood's son." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, and it caught Ethan completely off guard. "Yes," he managed his own voice, sounding thin and reedy in comparison. "My father is... He passed 2 years ago." A flicker of something was its sorrow recognition passed through Matokoda's eyes. It was there and gone in an instant. He was a man who kept his word. The chief said the statement, hanging in the air, freighted with meaning that Ethan couldn't yet grasp. He then gestured with his chin toward the cabin. "My daughter. Her name is Anpetu. It means radiant day. I wish to see her." The tension in Ethan's shoulders eased by a fraction. A request, not a demand, backed by an immediate storm of arrows. "Of course," Ethan said, stepping back and gesturing toward the door. "She is weak. Her fever is high." Matokoda walked past him, his broad shoulders momentarily blocking the light from the doorway. He moved with a heavy heart, each step that of a father fearing the worst. The young warrior with the hawk feather, whose name was One-Blee Eagle, made a move to follow his hand, resting on the hilt of a knife. Matokoda stopped him with a raised hand, not even turning around. The command was absolute. One-Blee froze his face, a mixture of frustration and fierce loyalty. Ethan followed the chief inside. The small cabin suddenly felt crowded, dominated by the Lakota leader's presence. Matokoda went straight to the cot. He knelt beside it, his large, powerful frame seeming to shrink as he looked down upon his daughter. He reached out a hand, his calloused fingers impossibly gentle as he brushed a stray strand of hair from Anpetu's forehead. A low sound, a guttural expression of pure paternal anguish escaped his lips. Anpetu stirred under his touch, her eyelids fluttering. "Ut!" The word was a bare whisper, a ghost of a sound. "Father," Matokoda answered in their native tongue, his voice soft and soothing, a stark contrast to the powerful chieftain who had faced down Ethan moments before. He felt her forehead, his jaw tightening at the heat he found there. He looked around the small, sparse cabin, at the bucket of water, the damp rags, the single cot where his daughter lay. His eyes came to rest on the small buckskin pouch sitting on the table. He looked from the pouch to Ethan, a question in his eyes. "It was tucked inside her dress," Ethan explained. "I didn't open it." Matokoda reached for the pouch, his movements slow and deliberate. He recognized it instantly. His gaze softened with a deep ancestral memory. He loosened the rawhide cord and tipped the contents into his palm. It wasn't a weapon or a secret message in the way Ethan might have imagined. It was a single, smooth stone, no bigger than a thumb. But it was a remarkable color, a deep, vibrant blue, like a piece of the sky captured and held in solid form. A network of fine white lines like tiny lightning strikes crisscrossed its surface. The stone of shared skies. Matokoda said, his voice thick with emotion. He held it up for Ethan to see. "My grandfather gave its twin to your grandfather. It was a pact, made long before the gold seekers came, before the iron horse scarred the plains. A pact of peace between the House of Blackwood and the band of Matokoda. It promised that in times of drought, your family would share the water of the hidden spring, and my people would honor your borders and hunt only what was needed. Your father Marcus honored this pact. He renewed it with me after your grandfather passed." Ethan stared at the stone, his mind reeling. The hidden spring. He knew of it. A small, secluded spring, deep within a rocky canyon on the northern edge of his property. His father had always been strangely protective of that area, warning him away from it. He'd claimed the rocks were unstable. Now a deeper truth was revealed. It wasn't just a spring. It was a secret, a covenant. I didn't know," Ethan stammered. "He never told me." Perhaps he did not have time. Lakota said, his gaze returning to his daughter. Or perhaps he thought the time for such pacts was over. He gently placed the blue stone back in Anpetu's small, limp hand. "Anpetu was bringing this to you, a sign of trust, a reminder. The creeks of our lands are dry and our people are thirsty. She was coming to the son of Marcus Blackwood to ask for the pact to be honored once more." The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture far more complex and dangerous than Ethan had imagined. The girl wasn't lost. She was an envoy, a messenger of peace. "But what happened to her?" Ethan asked, gesturing to the feverish child. "She wasn't attacked. It's like she's been poisoned." At the word poisoned, Lakota's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a cold fire. He looked at Anpetu with a new urgency. He leaned in close, examining her lips, her fingernails. He then looked at the nearly empty canteen at his own hip, and a look of dawning horror crossed his face. "The water," he breathed. "Before she left, she drank from the waters of Unchimaka Grandmother Earth, from a stream we thought was still pure, a day's ride from here. Others in our camp have begun to feel unwell. A sickness of the gut, a fever that burns from the inside. We thought it a bad omen, a curse." A chilling thought took root in Ethan's mind. A sickness, poison, a day's ride away. That would place the stream in the foothills north of his own land. And there was only one other person who had any business up in that remote rocky territory, Silas Cain. Silas Cain was a sour, grasping man who ran the neighboring ranch, the Seacross. He and Ethan's father had been bitter rivals for years. Cain was a man who saw the land not as something to be lived with, but something to be conquered and bled dry. He'd long coveted the Blackwood Reach, making no secret of his belief that Marcus Blackwood was a fool for not exploiting it more aggressively. Recently, rumors had been circulating in the town of Redemption about Cain dabbling in small-scale mining, searching for silver in the hills that separated their properties, an illegal, unregulated operation. "There is another rancher," Ethan said, choosing his words carefully. "His name is Silas Cain. His land borders mine to the north up in the hills. He's been prospecting up there, near the headwaters of those creeks." Lakota rose to his full height, his face a grim mask of fury. The image of a grieving father was gone, replaced by the visage of a war chief whose people had been attacked in the most insidious way imaginable. "This Cain," he said, his voice dangerously low. "He would poison the water. He would poison his own mother for a glint of silver in the rock." Ethan replied without hesitation. The twist was no longer just a possibility. It was a terrifying certainty. This wasn't a natural sickness. Anpetu wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was the first casualty in a war she didn't even know had begun. A war started not by a clash of cultures, but by one man's greed. Lakota turned and strode to the door, pulling it open. He barked a series of sharp commands in Lakota. Wanbli and 2 other warriors immediately dismounted and ran towards the cabin. "Tokaheya and Nagi will fetch our Wikasawakan," Matokota explained, his eyes fixed on the dark hills to the north. "Our holy man. He knows the herbs. He may be able to fight this poison. Wanbli will stay. He will guard my daughter with his life." He turned back to Ethan, his expression hard, resolute. The fragile truce, born of a shared concern, was now being forged into something else, an alliance, an uneasy and dangerous one. "You say this man, this Silas Cain, is the serpent in this valley?" Matokota stated, his hand clenching into a fist. "Then you will show me his nest." The arrival of the Wikasawakan was as quiet and momentous as the appearance of the warriors had been. He was an old man named Chaitan or Falcon, his face a testament to 100 winters, each line a story. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, carrying a leather bundle filled with dried herbs, roots, and sacred objects. He entered the cabin not with the urgency of a physician, but with the solemnity of a priest entering a temple. While Chaitan tended to Anpei-tu, murmuring ancient chants and preparing a poultice that filled the small room with the earthy scents of sage and pine, Ethan and Matokota stood outside in the pre-dawn chill. The 100 warriors remained on the ridge, a silent, patient vigil under a canopy of fading stars. A fragile trust had been established, but the air was still thick with the potential for violence. Ethan found himself telling Matokota about Silas Cain. He spoke of Cain's relentless ambition, his blatant disregard for treaty lines and property borders. He recounted how a year ago Cain had dammed up a shared stream to divert more water to his own herd, nearly starting a range war before the spring rains had rendered the point moot. He described Cain's hired hands, a surly, transient lot with dead eyes and quick tempers. "My father called him the Serpent," Ethan said, staring north into the darkness where Cain's ranch lay. "He said Cain had a soul as barren as a salt flat." He then called over his own ranch hand, Gus, who had been sleeping in the small bunkhouse and had watched the night's events unfold with a mixture of terror and awe. Gus was a grizzled old-timer, his skin like tanned leather, who had worked for Ethan's father for 20 years. He was loyal, cantankerous, and knew the valley's history better than anyone. "Gus," Ethan said, "tell Chief Matokota what you told me last spring, about what you saw up in Coyote Canyon." Gus spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the Lakota leader. There was a lifetime of ingrained caution in his gaze, but his loyalty to Ethan and to the memory of Marcus Blackwood won out. "Saw it with my own 2 eyes. Gus began, his voice raspy. "Was tracking a cougar up near the northern ridge, the one Cain claims is his but ain't. Found his camp. Wasn't no prospector's camp. He had wagons, heavy ones covered, and barrels, metal barrels. Saw 'em dumping something into the creek that feeds down this way. A thick, milky white liquid. The rocks where they poured it. They got a sickness to 'em now. A slimy green moss grows there, and nothing else. Not even weeds." Matokota listened intently, his expression growing darker with every word. "Arsenic," he said the word a venomous hiss. "The gold seekers use it to separate the shining metal from the rock. It is a powerful poison. Slow. It burns the gut and boils the blood." He looked toward the cabin where his daughter lay. "It is the serpent's bite." The pieces now formed a horrifyingly clear picture. Cain wasn't just prospecting. He was running a small illegal mining operation, likely processing ore he'd high-graded from the bigger claims in the Black Hills. To avoid detection and the cost of proper disposal, he was simply dumping the toxic chemical runoff, the arsenic, into the creek system. A creek system that fed the streams where the Lakota drew their water. It was an act of such callous indifference, it bordered on mass murder. Cain probably didn't even think about the Lakota. To him they were phantoms, a non-entity. Or perhaps it was a calculated cruelty. If the local tribe became sickened or was wiped out, there would be fewer eyes to witness his illegal activities, fewer potential obstacles to his expansion. He might even have hoped the sickness would be blamed on the settlers, sparking a conflict that would serve his chaotic ends. "The pact my father made," Ethan said, a new understanding dawning. It wasn't just about water. It was about protecting this valley. Together. Lakota nodded slowly. "Your father saw the coming flood. He knew one man, one people could not stand against it alone. He saw that the true fight was not between the Lakota and the settler, but between those who honor the land and those who defile it." He looked at Ethan, his gaze intense, measuring. "Your father was a man of vision. The question is, are you?" Before Ethan could answer, Chayton emerged from the cabin. His face was grave. He spoke to Lakota in Lakota, his voice low and urgent. Lakota translated his own voice, tight with controlled emotion. "The poison is strong," he said. "Chayton's herbs can soothe the pain, they can fight the fever, but they cannot cleanse the source from her body. She needs pure water, great amounts of it, to flush the serpent's venom from her blood. The water from your hidden spring." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Of course, I'll take you there." "This is not all," Lakota continued, his eyes hardening into flint. "Chayton says that even with the pure water, she is weak. Her spirit is close to the journey. A great shock, a great sorrow, could send her on that path." He paused, letting the weight of his next word settle. If her father were to fall in battle, her spirit might follow his. The implication was clear. A direct assault on Cain's camp, a battle between 100 warriors and Cain's hired guns, was the Lakota way. It would be swift, brutal, and righteous. But if Lakota were to be killed in the fighting, it could mean Anpetu's death as well. His own life was now inextricably linked to his daughter's survival. He was trapped. The leader of his people could not show weakness or fear, but the father could not risk orphaning his child, and in doing so, killing her. It was Wanbli, the young fiery warrior, who voiced the tribe's frustration. He stepped forward, his hand gripping his rifle. "We will ride," he declared in Lakota, his voice ringing with righteous fury. "We will burn the poisoner from his nest and send his black soul to the Creator." Several other warriors murmured their assent, their hands moving to their own weapons. The patient vigil was threatening to erupt into a storm of vengeance. Lakota raised a hand, silencing them. He looked at Ethan, not as a chief to a settler, but as one man to another, both caught in a closing trap. "My heart tells me to ride with them," he said, his voice raw with conflict. "To wash the earth with the blood of this serpent, Cain. But my daughter, my Anpetu." Ethan saw the path forward. It was a narrow, dangerous trail, but it was the only one they had. It would require him to step fully into his father's boots, to embrace the legacy he had only just begun to understand. "A direct assault is what Cain would expect," Ethan said, his voice firm, resolute. "He'll be fortified, waiting. You'll lose warriors, and you risk everything." He looked from Lakota to Wanbli. "But he does not know that we know. He thinks his crime is a secret hidden in the hills. He does not know that a Lakota chief and a rancher's son are standing together. We have an advantage he doesn't. We have knowledge, and we have surprise. He turned and pointed towards the rugged canyon that marked the northern edge of his property. The hidden spring is in that canyon. Cain's camp is just beyond the ridge on the other side. He watches the main trail. He doesn't watch the canyon. He thinks it's impassable. It is, Gus chimed in. Marcus himself said only a fool or a goat would try that path. My father wasn't a goat, Ethan said, a grim smile touching his lips. But he taught me how to climb like one. I can get through that canyon. I can get into his camp. You don't need 100 warriors to stop a snake. You just need one man to get close enough to cut off its head. The plan was desperate, a thin thread spun from courage and necessity. It was met with immediate resistance from Wanbley. This is our fight, he argued, his voice sharp with indignation. The child is Lakota. The poison was meant for us. We will not hide behind a white man while he fights our battle. This is not about hiding, Lakota countered, his voice cutting through the young warrior's anger. This is about wisdom. The serpent does not expect the rancher. He expects the warrior. Ethan Blackwood will be the unexpected path, the stone that turns the landslide. He looked at Ethan, a deep, searching gaze. But you will not go alone. A snake has more than one head. You say this Cain has hired guns. He turned and pointed to two of his most trusted warriors. They were older than Wanbley, their faces calm and seasoned. This is Kangi the crow and Hehaka the elk. Kangi sees what is hidden in the shadows. Hehaka moves without sound. They will go with you. They will not be your soldiers. They will be your eyes and your ears. They will follow your path, but they will walk it in the Lakota way. Do you accept? Ethan looked at the two men. Kangi was lean and wiry, his eyes sharp and intelligent. Hehaka was broad and powerfully built, yet he stood with a quiet stillness that made him seem a part of the landscape. Ethan saw no malice in their eyes, only a profound competence. He nodded. I accept. We leave at once. While Gus led Lakota and a small group with water skins toward the secret entrance of the hidden spring to fetch the pure water for Anpei-Tu, Ethan prepared for the mission. He shed his heavy leather chaps and spurs, trading his riding boots for softer worn moccasins his father had acquired in a trade years ago. He took his Winchester 1873 from its pegs and a box of cartridges. His Colt remained strapped to his hip. He moved with a quiet, focused intensity. This was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. It was about honoring a pact he hadn't known existed. He met Kangi and Hehaka at the mouth of the canyon as the first pale light of dawn painted the eastern sky. They carried bows and quivers of arrows as well as knives. They moved with a silent, fluid grace that made Ethan feel clumsy and loud. No words were exchanged. A nod from Kangi was all it took. They melted into the shadows of the canyon. The journey was grueling. The path his father had shown him as a boy was treacherous, a narrow ledge clinging to the sheer rock face, often crumbling underfoot. Below them, the canyon floor was a jumble of jagged boulders and thorny brush. But where Ethan saw obstacles, the Lakota warriors saw a path. They moved with an astonishing agility, their feet finding purchase where there seemed to be none, their bodies blending with the rock and shadow. Hehaka would often pause, his head cocked, listening to the faintest sounds carried on the wind. Kangi would scan the terrain, pointing out a loose rock or a safer handhold that Ethan had missed. They were not just following. They were guiding, protecting. After 2 hours of nerve-wracking climbing, they reached the top of the ridge overlooking Cain's operation. Ethan peered through a screen of stunted junipers. The camp was larger than he'd expected. A makeshift sluice box built from raw timber diverted a significant portion of the creek's water. Piles of excavated rock and tailings littered the area. A crude shack stood near a large, smoldering fire pit, and 3 canvas tents were pitched nearby. The source of the poison was sickeningly clear. A stack of leaking metal barrels, their contents staining the ground. A sickly yellowish-white sat perilously close to the water's edge. There were 5 men in the camp. Silas Cain stood near the fire, a short, stocky man with a florid face and a perpetual scowl, yelling at 2 of his hired hands, who were struggling with a piece of machinery. 2 other men armed with rifles were positioned as lookouts. Though their posture was lazy, their attention more on their tin coffee cups than the surrounding landscape. They were confident in their isolation. Kangi touched Ethan's arm and pointed. He traced a line with his finger, indicating the positions of the lookouts, the men by the fire, and Cain himself. He then pointed to a large pile of loose rock and scree directly above the camp. He looked at Hehaka, who nodded in understanding. A plan was formed without a single word. Hehaka faded back into the rocks, circling around to a position above and behind the camp. Kangi gestured for Ethan to ready his Winchester. The crow knocked an arrow to his bowstring. The plan was simple distraction and precision. Ethan waited, his heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm. He rested the barrel of his rifle in a notch between 2 rocks, the cold metal a comfort in his hands. He took a deep breath, lining up his sights on the lookout, to the left, the one furthest from the others. He would not kill if he could avoid it, but he would not hesitate if he had to. The signal came as a faint, almost inaudible bird, call the cry of a canyon wren. It was Hehaka in position. The world exploded in a cloud of dust and a roar of cascading rock. Hehaka had dislodged the scree pile. It wasn't a massive landslide, but it was more than enough. Boulders and gravel rained down on the far side of the camp, crushing one of the empty tents and sending a shower of debris into the creek. The effect was instantaneous. The men yelled in alarm, spinning around their rifles coming up. Cain and his men stared in confusion at the dust cloud, trying to figure out what had happened. The 2 lookouts, their complacency shattered, took a few steps toward the commotion. Their backs now turned to Ethan and Kangi. It was the opening they needed. Thwump! Kangi's arrow flew with impossible speed and accuracy, burying itself deep in the shoulder of the right-hand lookout. The man screamed and dropped his rifle, clutching at the feathered shaft. Simultaneously, Ethan squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder. His shot was true. He hadn't aimed for a kill, but for a disabling blow. The bullet struck the left-hand lookout in the thigh. The man howled and crumpled to the ground, his leg buckling beneath him. 2 guards down in as many seconds. Chaos erupted. Cain and his remaining 2 men dove for cover behind the stacked barrels, firing blindly up at the ridge. Bullets whined through the air, chipping fragments of rock near Ethan's head. "Fools, it's an ambush!" Cain shrieked, his voice thin with panic. "Must be those damn Indians!" Ethan and Kangi were already moving, scrambling down a steep wooded draw that offered better cover closing the distance. They were joined by Hehaka, who seemed to appear from the very air beside them. The firefight was short and brutal. Cain's men were hired guns, not soldiers. They were panicked, firing wildly. Ethan, Kangi, and Hehaka were focused, their actions economical and precise. Hehaka, using his powerful bow, sent an arrow into the leg of one of the men, peeking out from behind the barrels. The man shrieked and fell back out of the fight. Now it was just Cain and one remaining gunman. "I'll give you double them," Cain screamed, his voice cracking. "Whatever they're paying you, I'll double it." Ethan emerged from the trees, his Winchester leveled. "This isn't about money, Cain." Cain's eyes widened in shock and recognition. "Blackwood? What in the devil's name?" His face contorted with rage. You're in league with them savages." The last gunman chose that moment to make a break for it, scrambling from behind the barrels and sprinting toward the trees. He never made it. Kangi stepped from the shadows, not with an arrow, but with the butt of his bow, striking the man hard at the base of the skull. The gunman dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. Only Silas Cain was left. He stood alone, his bravado melting away into pure animal fear. He fumbled for his pistol, his hands shaking. "It was just business, Blackwood," he pleaded, his pistol finally clearing its holster. "Just business." He raised the gun to fire, but he was too slow. Ethan's Colt was already in his hand. The single shot echoed through the canyon, a sharp, definitive crack. Cain grunted, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at the red flower blooming on his chest. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed into the poisoned mud his own greed had created. Silence descended, broken only by the groans of the wounded men and the gurgle of the defiled creek. Ethan stood over Cain's body, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. Kangi and Hehaka emerged from the shadows, their faces impassive. The fight was over. The serpent was dead. But the venom was still in the water. They did not linger in the camp of the dead. With cold efficiency, Ethan and the two warriors rounded up the wounded gunmen, binding their hands and tending to their injuries just enough to keep them alive. They would be left for Sheriff Barlow of Redemption to find, along with a story of a mining dispute gone wrong. The truth was too complex, too fragile for the blunt instrument of settler law. The real justice had already been delivered. Their most important work was at the creek. Using Cain's own tools, they smashed the remaining barrels of arsenic, allowing the last of the poison to spill out onto the dry, sterile ground far from the water. Then with pry bars and raw muscle, they dismantled the sluice box and broke the dam, freeing the creek to run its natural course again. It was a small act, but a significant one. It was the beginning of healing. The return journey through the canyon was somber. The adrenaline of the fight had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the heavy weight of what they had done. Ethan had taken a man's life. It wasn't a thing he had wanted, but looking at the pristine wilderness around him, at the clear sky above, he knew it had been necessary. He had not just protected a pact or a spring or a child. He had defended the valley itself. When they emerged from the canyon mouth, as the sun began to dip towards the western horizon, they were met by Lakota. He stood alone, waiting. And Petu was not with him. Ethan's heart seized with fear. Lakota saw the question in his eyes. "The water from the spring is pure and strong," the chief said, his voice quiet. "Chaitan has been giving it to her. The fever has not broken, but it has not worsened. Her spirit holds on. She is a fighter, like her father." He looked at the three of them, at Ethan dusty, and blood spattered, at Kangi and Hehaka, grim and silent. And like her new friends. He looked past Ethan at the plume of smoke now rising from the distant ridge, a signal fire lit by Wanbli. It told the waiting warriors that the task was done, that the threat was neutralized. "You have done a great thing today," Lakota said, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. The gesture was one of profound respect, of a bond forged in shared danger. You have honored your father's name and created your own. The Bluestone Pact is not just renewed. It is now written in blood and courage. It will not be forgotten. He then presented Ethan with a gift. It was Hehaka's bow. Hehaka wishes you to have this, Lakota explained, not as payment, but as a symbol. You fought with the cunning of a white man, but with the heart of a Lakota for the good of the land. This bow will remind you that you have allies in these hills. You are not alone. Ethan accepted the gift, his throat too tight for words. He simply nodded at the smooth, powerful wood of the bow, feeling solid and real in his hands. That night, the 100 warriors departed as silently as they had arrived. They melted back into the plains, taking their wounded chief's daughter with them, leaving Ethan's ranch in a profound and ringing silence. Ethan stood on his porch for a long time, watching them go, the bow in his hand. The valley felt different now. It felt like his, not in the way of ownership, but in the way of belonging, of responsibility. The next morning, he rode out with Gus to the hidden spring. The entrance was cleverly concealed behind a waterfall that was now, after their work, beginning to flow more strongly. Inside the cavern was cool and damp, filled with the sound of trickling water. The spring itself was a pool of water so clear it was almost invisible. This was the lifeblood of the valley. A lifeblood he now shared the duty to protect. He would never know for certain when Anpetu's fever finally broke. He would receive no letter, no messenger. But 2 weeks later, as he was mending a fence on the northern edge of his property, he found something tied to the post. It was a single eagle feather, its white and black tip sharp against the blue sky. It was a sign of courage, of friendship, a sign of life. A shared dawn had broken over the valley, fragile and new, but full of promise. The future remained an unwritten page, but for the first time, Ethan Blackwood felt ready to help write it. That single eagle feather marked not an ending, but a new unspoken beginning. Ethan's story is a powerful reminder that the Wild West wasn't just a tale of conflict, but also of unexpected connections and moments of profound courage that history often forgets. It shows us that true strength isn't found in the gun you carry, but in the choices you make when you're standing at a crossroads between fear and compassion. The line between enemy and ally can be as thin as a child's whisper. If this story of bravery, sacrifice, and the forging of an unlikely peace in a harsh and unforgiving land resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story with real heart and drama. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the dusty trails of the American West. Click that notification bell so you never miss a chapter of our shared history.